guess. Whoa! Oh! What the? Holy no! What?
Whoa! I think we are dead.
At 3:14 local time, a Patriot battery operator on the island of Bahrain picks up the first contact. Low, slow, bearing northeast, crawling up the Gulf at just over 100 knots. He watches for 12 seconds, then a second contact appears behind it, then a third, then more and more. Shahed 136 swept-wing kamikaze drones, each carrying enough explosive to gut a building. At least a dozen of them aimed at Naval Support Activity Bahrain, a base supporting thousands of American personnel and their families across the island. The battery commander's problem is not tactical. Slow, straight, about the speed of an old Piper Cub, the kind that looks harmless until it isn't. His problem is arithmetic. A PAC-3 interceptor costs $4 million a round. Firing a $4 million interceptor at a $30,000 drone isn't a win, it's a trade you can't afford to keep making. And every round he spends is one he won't have if something bigger shows up behind the swarm. But protecting civilian life is non-negotiable. He fires. The canister blows. A PAC-3 clears the launcher on a pillar of white exhaust. Accelerating to Mach 5 inches seconds, a guided mass built to collide, turning speed into destruction. The first drone is shredded over the harbor. Debris rains into the water. He fires again, same result. The drones keep coming because Iran didn't send a dozen, they sent enough to drain the rack. What the battery commander doesn't know is that the Shahed were never meant to hit anything. They were bait. The Patriot crews tear through the last of the swarm, both batteries still angled northeast. And then it happens. A Khorramshahr ballistic missile drops from directly overhead, descending on a near-vertical trajectory at nearly Mach 10, a heavy warhead slipping through while the system is looking the wrong way. The warhead hits a service center 130 feet from the command hub. The second strike slams into a communications installation. 2 hits. Not enough to cripple the base, but enough to make one thing clear. The perimeter had been breached. Within minutes, the response began. Not chaotic, not rushed, but immediate. Across the network, units shifted to combat readiness.
1 second, I'm going to get a radio check on a different radio. How do you hear this radio?
Combat alert was raised across all branches of the United States military. Air Force units, Marine Corps, fighter squadrons all received the signal for combat readiness. The order went out immediately.
Any aircraft in class golf, stay position all the time. Sprinkle that right all over this.
At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Marines were transported from their barracks to the airfield by bus. Upon arrival, they began loading into a C-17 Globemaster III waiting on the tarmac with its rear ramp down. At the same time, cargo handlers were bringing in additional equipment on forklifts and flatbed carts. Portable generators, ammunition crates, communications gear, medical supplies. Everything was strapped down inside the cargo bay alongside the Marines. These aircraft were preparing for immediate deployment from the forward base. At a nearby section of the airfield, several more C-17s were already being loaded. Cargo handlers drove armored vehicles up the ramps, tactical buggies, armored trucks, MRAPs, and other combat vehicles. At a separate airfield, mechanics were preparing fighter jets that would be used over the coming days for sustained strikes on enemy military targets. Every aircraft got a full inspection. Avionics checked, radar systems tested, wiring and electronics gone over panel by panel. Missiles and guided bombs were loaded onto the pylons. Engine covers were removed, intakes inspected, fuel systems checked. These fighters needed to be in perfect condition for continuous combat sorties over the next several days. Meanwhile, at another location on the base, soldiers were in the hangar going through their personal gear. They packed their duffel bags and rucksacks with everything they would need for an indefinite deployment: uniforms, boots, hygiene kits, personal items. These soldiers were not going on a short rotation. They were being sent forward with no defined timeline, no return date on the calendar. At dusk, the order came to prepare for boarding. The soldiers formed up in columns outside the hangar and began marching toward their assigned aircraft. They walked up the ramps and took their seats inside the C-17s. Loadmasters performed final checks on cargo and head counts. The ramps closed. One by one, the aircraft taxied to the runway and took off, disappearing into the darkening sky. Upon arrival at the designated forward operating area, the C-17s landed and unloading began immediately. Ramps dropped. Soldiers filed out. Vehicles were unchained and driven off. Cargo pallets were pulled out by forklifts. Everything moved at an accelerated pace. These same aircraft would turn around and fly again, continuing the flow of troops and equipment already staged in the region. For the soldiers stepping off the ramp onto the tarmac, this base was now home for as long as the operation required. No set timeline, no return date. They grabbed their bags, followed directions from base personnel, and moved toward their assigned positions. The buildup was underway and more flights were already inbound. On the airfield, maintenance crews worked around the clock preparing fighters for combat sorties. Aircraft were parked in rows across the apron, some under open sky, others inside hardened shelters. Fuel trucks pulled up alongside each jet. A mechanic connected the single-point refueling nozzle to the fuselage and began pumping JP-8 fuel into the tanks. Flow was monitored from the truck's gauge panel. Once full, the hose was disconnected, the cap sealed, and the truck moved to the next aircraft. Weapons teams brought ordnance on loading carts. Air-to-air missiles were mounted on wingtip rails. Guided bombs were secured under the wings using hoists. Each weapon was connected to the aircraft's system's wiring harnesses plugged in. Data links confirmed, arming pins inserted with red flags hanging from them. Every weapon received a visual inspection. Mounting points checked. Release systems verified. Alignment confirmed. The process repeated across the entire flight line, one aircraft after another. Fuel, weapons, airframe, avionics, flight controls, engines. By the time the pilots arrived for their briefing, every jet on that ramp was fueled, armed, inspected, and ready to fly. What came next wasn't preparation. It was execution. Paratroopers were loading into a C-17 through the rear cargo ramp. They moved in 2 columns, full combat load, parachutes, rucksacks, weapons, ammunition. Inside the cargo bay, they took their seats as loadmasters packed them in tight. The ramp closed. The aircraft lifted off. In the air, the soldiers began their pre-jump routine. Gear checks, harness adjustments, static lines hooked to the overhead cable. The jumpmaster called it out. Stand up, hook up, check equipment, sound off. The doors opened. The green light came on. One by one, they stepped into the open air. Parachutes deployed behind them, forming a line across the sky as they descended toward the target area below. At the same time, helicopter crews were already airborne. Door gunners mounted their weapons into position. Ammunition belts were fed into the system. Charging handles pulled back. The guns were hot. The helicopters flew low and fast, moving in formation toward the target zone. Inside the cabin, the gunners stayed locked on their sights, scanning the terrain below through tinted visors. The formation reached the target area. The first bursts of fire came from the helicopters. Machine guns opened up in controlled bursts, rounds cutting across the ground below. Brass casings scattered across the cabin floor as the weapons cycled. The gunner adjusted aim, shifted position, and fired again. The helicopters banked, circled, and came back in for another pass. Below them, the paratroopers were already on the ground. Air and ground forces moved together, coordinated, continuous. The operation was fully underway. After completing the engagement, the helicopters broke off and began their return to base. The formation pulled away from the target area, leaving the zone behind. The mission was complete. What you've seen is only one part of the operation. The rest of it is already in motion.